Lecture 20? Are you kidding? What? We're almost done. This is the first lecture from chapter 32, Fauvism and Expressionism. And as you can see, we have broken past 1900, and we are about 1900 to 1925 in this lecture. Some historical events to keep in mind while you're listening to this lecture of Fauvism and Expressionism. You can see that in 1900, Sigmund Freud published his interpretation of dreams, and it introduced his theory of the unconscious with respect to dream interpretation, discusses what would later become the theory of the Oedipus complex, and that is a child's unconscious sexual desire for the opposite sex parent and hatred for the same sex parent. And it comes from the Greek tragedy Oedipus, in which the lead figure kills his father and marries his mother. Also, at the beginning of the 1900s, the Wright brothers flew a plane for the first time ever. They went 120 feet at 6.8 miles per hour after years of messing with the mechanics of how to fly. Einstein published his theory of relativity, and that is where space and time are interwoven into a single continuum known as space-time. And events that occur at the same time for one observer could occur at different times for another. So if you're traveling light speed, time kind of slows down for you. I'm not going to get into it. This is not a physics class. Finally, World War I is a series of international incidents that caused old alliances to solidify, and all of Europe was at war with itself. Countries wanted to show off their new technologies. They had machine guns, tanks. They used trench warfare. There was chemicals, mustard gas, flamethrowers, U-boats. It was like this really exciting time to be in the military-industrial complex designing things, because there were a lot of new weapons out there, and it was kind of like they were really eager to use them on each other. Now, World War I doesn't really play a big role in what we're going to talk about today, but just know it's kind of looming in the distance there, and when we get to Dadaism, it plays like a huge part. All right, here's just a few of the paintings we'll be looking at today. First, I put the Gauguin in there to give you some reference to how that happened right before the turn of the century. Gauguin is very influential with these painters, so he's important to keep on the timeline with them. We'll look at Matisse, something from Emil Nold. Kirchner, we'll also look at Schiele, Paula Modersohn-Becker, Kandinsky, and Franz Marc. Okay, we'll begin with the Fauves in France, and just know that there was a group of these painters known as the Fauves, but we're just going to talk about Matisse today because you can kind of get everything of the Fauves in his paintings. So they emphasized color over realistic representation. Their brushwork was all over the place. They simplified things so that there wasn't a lot of detail. And as I'd mentioned earlier, Gauguin plays a big role in this. So does Seurat, actually, or Signac, who was a friend of Seurat's. And that you'll see that Matisse will use this idea of saturated colors, but then he'll also sort of combine not really pointillistic, but kind of like pointillism. But he takes those two things and he creates something new out of it. He's doing something new with those two things. First of all, look at I want to show you this poster because there's a few things I want to talk about, but look at the writing on that. That's very much sort of an Art Nouveau style, right? And it's important that we talked about Art Nouveau because it informs this thing that we're looking at. But this is a poster to announce the Autumn Salon. The Autumn Salon was used to fill in this void of Parisian cultural consumption that followed the return of the bourgeoisie from their summer holidays. So it was kind of like it was a salon in between other salons during the year, and the people needed something to do when they came back from their holidays. I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but it bears repeating that by 1905, the process of being outraged by an artwork or by a group of artworks was actually an expected part of the consumption of art. The Autumn Salon in France opened to such avant-garde artists like Derain, Matisse, and these young painters were described as wild beasts or fauves, and they created works with really strong colors and expressive brushwork. And one of Fauvism's major contributions to modern art was its radical goal of separating color from its descriptive purpose and allowing it to exist as an independent element. It's kind of like what Gauguin did when I showed you the Jacob wrestling the angel and how the ground was red, but the Fauves took it and ran with it. Color could project a mood, it could establish a structure within the work of art without it having to be true to the natural world. Here's a perfect example of that. We'll talk about this in detail, but I want to first talk about a little bit about the Salon d'Automne, which was described by Louis Vaucel, who was a critic, as a Roman circus. And he called this painting, Matisses' Woman with the Hat, as having the fate of a Christian virgin cast before the wild beasts of the circus. So he was not kind to Matisse when he was critiquing this. And it was good. At this point, that kind of criticism was really valuable to a painter because it meant you were doing something new. And that's kind of what the Parisian audience was looking for by this point. Matisse explored a desire for deliberate disharmonies. And that means that he presented non-naturalistic colors and blunt brushwork on an otherwise ordinary subject. Like he took this painting, I think it's his wife, and he just kind of messed with everything that could have been messed with and still produced something really interesting. And you can think it's beautiful or not, but it definitely was new and different. Matisse had kind of one goal for this painting, and that was individual expression. Everything that happened in this painting was this way of saying, this is how I feel about the subject, this is how I wanted to portray the subject. In other words, the artist's direct experience of his subjects and his emotional response to the subject and his intuition were all way more important than academic theory or even elevated subject matter, such as a grand history painting. It all came down to the artist's subjective experience. So the reason that I'm just showing you Matisse stuff for Fauvism is because it's so different. I mean, this was a year earlier, and you can see that it's very different from what you just looked at. And then the thing that we look at after this is also going to be very different. So he kind of encapsulated all these different movements in Fauvism itself. So this painting is called Luxe, Calme et Volupté, and it translates just as it sounds, luxury, calm, voluptuousness. And he painted it while he was hanging out with his friend Signac, who was a pointillist painter, and they were in Saint-Tropez in the south of France. And the title comes from a poem by Charles Baudelaire, who we talked about when we discussed Impressionism. And the poem was called L'Invitation au Voyage, and it's from The Flowers of Evil. So what's happening in this? First of all, he borrows from post-impressionism or neo-impressionist style in its brushwork. This kind of looks like a pointillist work of art, but he doesn't use that theory of color that Seurat was using. He's not saying mix this with your eyes and it creates a pleasing color palette in which your mind constructs. This is more like, hey, this painting style creates a frenetic energy that can be exciting. And the title implies relaxation, and the figures, they do seem to be posing in a classical style, but the aggressive colors and the lack of differentiation between foreground and background makes this idea of calmness kind of contradictory to the title. And again, our eyes don't see this the same. Imagine having never seen a painting like this before and then reading that this is supposed to be luxurious and calm. He seems to be attempting to use old ideas like the classical poses, or even people were used to pointillism at this point. But he might have been trying to use these old ideas to get us used to some new ideas. He once said that he wanted his art to feel like sitting in an old, comfortable chair. And nothing about Matisse makes me think sitting in an old, comfortable chair. However, the fact that he uses, and we'll see this in other things, typical poses or borrows from other art historical movements might be his way of introducing you to a new thing by using old things. This painting anticipates the Fauves' imaginative use of expressive color, and color and form are key ways that the early 20th century artists began to abandon representation for abstraction. So this is kind of the jumping off point for 100% abstract painting. If you first mess with what you can do with color, then you can go, oh, we don't even need to have the subject matter anymore. Here's another painting that has this kind of really jarring color scheme, but also looks different in painting style or brush work. Everything looks kind of different. So Matisse changes a lot during his career. But when you lump him in with the Fauves early on, he changes almost every year, year to year, his style changes. This is Le Bonheur de Vivre, or The Joy of Life, and it transforms hedonistic pursuits, which means erotic adventures, within a pastoral landscape into kind of a vibrant arrangement. This is the Fauve's answer to the Rococo fête galante. Color doesn't conform to the realities of nature. It does express emotions. Colors contribute as much to the joyous mood as the naked revelers of the figures themselves. The composition contains continual movement, but simultaneous calmness or serenity. This is a place that's full of life and love and free from want or fear. But instead of it being in a contemporary scene or a park or on the banks of the Seine, in which we have seen in the past, Matisse kind of just takes us to this mythical paradise. It's almost a return to mythology, but it's revolutionary because if you study the figures in the foreground and the midground, you will notice that their scale is badly skewed. I mean, how giant must those women be in the middle? They're the same size as the woman that's playing the flute in the front. His shifting scale is actually the result of changing position in relation to figures, and this is why I talked about Einstein, because it's almost as if he's trying to make space-time happen in this painting. Like if you walked around this painting, if you were able to jump in, you might see somebody far away, and then the people that you're next to are close up. So he's trying to make it seem like you're traveling through this painting. All right, we're going to end this first part with this comparison. And I love Velázquez, as you probably now know. And these two paintings have a lot in common, even though they don't really seem like they do. So what I want you to do in the lecture question for this section is I want you to tell me the story that you think for each of these that's happening, and I want you to tell me how they are related, because I promise you there is some connection between these two paintings. Whether it be subject matter or the way that they are composed compositionally, I guess is the best way to say it, there's something going on that these things have in common. And again, this might have to do with Matisse's idea of that comfortable armchair thing. He might have thrown in some Velázquez nods here and there to tell people, it's okay, you've seen this before. It's a little jarring, but also it's familiar. All right, good luck with that comparison.